And so you guys are going to see it pop up on your screen that the meeting is being live streamed. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We might have a few people coming in yet as I speak, but thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to Gulf Coast Creation Care's 2021 Season of Creation series, Healing and Hope in a Time of Ecological Crisis. My name is Rhoda Vanderhart, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. We are live streaming this session to our Facebook page, so a recording will be made of this video. We ask that you keep yourself muted and your video off unless you are speaking. We are going to have a time of question and answer after our presenters talk, and so if you have questions that come up during their presentations, please feel free to put those questions into the chat box. And during the time of question and answer, you are welcome to turn your camera on and your mute off. If you are present and signed in with us on Zoom today, you can control whether you watch the session in speaker view or gallery view by toggling the view button in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. We suggest that you watch in speaker view to better see the speakers and their presentation. I am now going to turn the session over to Lella Lowe, who is going to introduce our special guests and moderate this session.
Thank you, Rhoda, and welcome again to everyone. I would like to begin this session in prayer. God, maker of marvels, you weave the planet and all its creatures in kinship. Your unifying love is revealed in the interdependence of relationships in the complex world that you have made. Save us from the illusion that humankind is separate and alone, and join us in communion with all inhabitants of the universe. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are about to begin the fourth of 4 workshops for this season of creation. The first 3 workshops in the 4-part series on hope and healing in a time of ecological crisis have focused on individual healing, from individual connections within a community to healing from a medical perspective and personal healing through connecting with nature. In this session, we will turn our attention to what can be done at the congregational level to promote hope and healing. The following quote is from a member of the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church's delegation to COP26, Dr. Lisa Gromlich, who is also a climate scientist affiliated with the University of Washington. And she says, as people of faith, we know the power of lamentation when we set aside denial to confront despair with honest cries of pain at loss and social injustice. From our ancient traditions, we know how to move beyond lament to imagine a vision of a more just and sustainable world. And finally, we know how to embrace hope that will fuel our engagement long after the COP26 meeting is over. Climate change calls all of us to action. And I think that we have invited the perfect duo to speak in response to this idea that the church is the perfect place to confront despair through grief and lament, and then instill hope through climate action. And I am both delighted and privileged to introduce Avery Davis Lamb and Amy Peterson. Avery is an activist, ecologist, and public theologian working at the intersection of Christianity and environmental justice. Avery has been working on climate resilience with churches caught in the precarity of the climate crisis, and you may want to ask him what the precarity of the climate crisis means. His research and organizing orbit around this question: how can churches be hubs of resilience, helping their communities weather the spiritual and physical storms of the climate crisis? He is the co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries. And I have heard Avery speak on a number of times on climate resilience, and I know that you're in for a treat. Amy Peterson is a writer, teacher, and candidate for ordination in the Episcopal Church. She is the author of 2 books, Where Goodness Still Grows, Reclaiming Virtue in an Age of Hypocrisy, and Dangerous Territory, My Misguided Quest to Save the World. Her work has appeared in publications such as Image, Washington Post, Christianity Today, Christian Century, and elsewhere. In fact, I was pleased to find a book review that she had written for Christian Century magazine just a couple of weeks ago in the October 5th issue. We will hear from both of our presenters and then open the floor up for questions, which you can enter through the chat option on your screen. There is a button at the bottom of your screen, or when the time comes, you may unmute and ask for yourself when the speakers are finished. I would like to remind you once again that we ask that you both mute yourselves and turn off your cameras for the duration of the presentation, unless you engage with our speakers during the Q&A period. And now I believe that Amy is going to begin today's conversation. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Lola. And thanks, Lola and Rhoda and Avery, for inviting me to be here and for putting this event together. I'm so delighted, and I especially loved that prayer and that quotation that you read, Lola. So perfect way to get us started. Just to kind of give everyone a sense of where we're headed here, I'm going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes about the practice of communal lament and why I think it's vital in responding to climate change. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what lament is. And I'm going to walk you through one exercise for creating a liturgy of lament within your own community. And then Avery will come on and talk, I think, a little more practically about actions communities have taken and can take together. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of discussion and Q&A as it goes. So why begin with lament? We're here to talk about hope and resilience, and we're starting with lament. And I think one of the challenges of taking action as a group, as a congregation, rather than as an individual when it comes to climate change or really anything, is that the members of a congregation may be in 100 different places, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, when it comes to the climate crisis. And that's part of the reason that in thinking about how to move a congregation towards hope and the kinds of constructive community action that help build hope and resilience, I like to begin with practices of lament, because practices of lament can be a way to move us toward the same starting point in those conversations. Wherever you're coming from, whatever your background or your initial thoughts or feelings are, a practice of lament can help get a group sort of on the same page. Because I think first we have to know that we're grieving the same things. We have to name our griefs before we move toward healing. And I think for some churches, the practice of lament might feel really normal, crying out to God with lament and anger and asking God to show up and bring salvation. These are standard in the Psalms. And for some congregations, they might also be really typical practices. But for others, like many of the churches I grew up in, lament can feel pretty strange. I grew up in sort of middle-class white churches, and we were pretty much used to being able to solve most of our problems. We didn't have a real visceral sense of our total dependence upon God, right? So that kind of kept us from lament. We didn't need to lament and cry out to God because we could usually take care of things. Or I think we might just not have known what to do with our negative emotions. And so when they came up, we would respond to grief with some aphoristic lines from scripture, like count it all joy, or in everything, give thanks, right? This is the day that the Lord has made. Using those lines of scripture to sort of ignore the reality of the grief that we might be feeling. But lament is actually a practice that we see modeled all throughout scripture. And so just to give us a sort of baseline definition of what lament is the practice of mourning what is wrong in the world and calling on God to repair it. Lament is the practice of mourning what is wrong in the world and calling on God to repair it. When we think about the things that we lament, lament is a part of repentance. So we lament the things that are wrong in the world because of our individual sins. I might lament that I ate 2 bowls of ice cream last night when I wasn't hungry at all. We also lament the things that are wrong in the world that we are not directly responsible for, but may be complicit in. So I might lament that the milk that was used in making that ice cream that I ate came from cows who were not well cared for, came from agricultural practices that were not beneficial for the whole life of the planet. But we also lament things that we're not even indirectly responsible for, those sort of big systemic broken things in our world, areas of injustice that we're not responsible for and we can't fix. We lament those things as well. So lament is the practice of mourning what's wrong in the world, whether we're responsible for it or not, and calling on God to repair it. We see lament in scripture, and I'm going to get to that. But first, I want to share a little story of how we see lament in the non-human created world. A few years ago, I read the story, maybe you read it too, of Tahlequah. Tahlequah is an orca who lamented the loss of her daughter for 1,000 miles off the coast of Seattle. After 17 months of pregnancy, she gave birth to a calf who lived for less than an hour. And then for 17 days, Tahlequah pushed her calf through the cold waters of the Pacific Ocean. It was an unprecedented show of mourning that drew international attention. Tahlequah's pod of killer whales is endangered. They're dependent on Chinook salmon for food, but Chinook salmon are also endangered, so food is scarce. And Tahlequah's baby wasn't just her baby. It was her pod's hope for the future. At the time when Tahlequah gave birth, scientists said that the 75 killer whales in the Salish Sea had only 5 years left to produce offspring if they hoped to continue to exist. And when I read the story of Tahlequah, I couldn't help but think that she knew that on some level, and that this unparalleled tour of grief she went on was a cry for humans to notice the damage we've done to her world, to her natural habitat. Orcas gestate for 17 months. Tahlequah pushed her dead calf through the waters for 17 days, 1 day for every month she'd spent bonding with her. I don't think that's a coincidence. 1 day for every month. I think that shows us that even in the natural world, we see that grief takes form and structure. And we see that in scripture too. The book of Lamentations, it's a book of 5 poems that express the grief and the anger and the fear and the despair of survivors in the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem. These were people who knew how it felt to lose the world as they had known it, which is, I think, some of what we're feeling too when we start to pay attention. So in these poems in Lamentation, there are multiple poetic voices. Some are individual, some are communal, and they call on God to see what's happened to their city and to act. And these poems, like Tahlequah's mourning, in a way, follow a structure. The first 4 poems are acrostics. Now, toss your mind back to your elementary school poetry lessons and remember that in an acrostic, the first, each line begins with a different letter. So the first begins with A, the second begins with B, C, D, and so on. And that's what these poems in the Book of Lamentations, that's how they're written in alphabetical order. Why write the poetry of sorrow in alphabetical order? This is a question posed by Hebrew scholar Kathleen O'Connor. And she argues that this poetic choice shows us something about the nature of grief. First, that grief is vast. It goes from A to Z, and then it goes from A to Z again and again and again. It seems infinite. It's more than we have language for. It needs every letter we've been given. Second, this artistic choice signifies that grief needs structure. O'Connor says, the alphabet gives both order and shape to suffering that is otherwise inherently chaotic, formless, and out of control. It tries to force unspeakable pain into a container that is familiar and recognizable, even as suffering eludes containment. Lamentations acrostics, they are all acrostics, but they're not all the same. The first two poems offer just one verse per letter. And then the third poem is 3 times as long. It uses 3 verses per letter, A, B, 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 C, C, C. And then the fourth poem is shorter than all of the others. I love the way that these poems show us that grief comes in waves, and that the waves can vary in intensity, and that perhaps sometimes we're too tired to lament as long as we once did. O'Connor again says the shortening poems in shrinking forms imply exhaustion, increasing numbness, and the loosening of structures to sustain confidence in God and in the future. So the Book of Lamentations, what does this show us about what lament is? It shows us that lament needs form. Lament needs to go from A to Z. Lament will repeat. It will go through cycles and come in waves that cannot be predicted. It will sometimes be communal and sometimes individual, and God will sometimes seem silent. But this gives us a form for structuring our lament, a model of multiple poetic voices, and a model of moving from A to Z. So early in the pandemic, really maybe 2 weeks in, we were in lockdown. My family, I have 2 kids, and when the pandemic started, they were 9 and 11. And once we realized we were going to be locked down for more than 2 weeks, we were having some grief about this. And so I started using this model of lamentations with my kids. I sat down with my kids in my journal and I wrote the alphabet down the side of a page. And I asked them what they were sad about with the coronavirus and everything that had been happening in their lives. And here's what we came up with to start. All the children who can't go to school, especially those who need school lunches. B, birthday parties might not happen. My son had a birthday 1 month into the pandemic. C, celebrations like weddings and Easter egg hunts canceled. D, death. E, empty streets and empty shelves. F, field trips canceled. G, grandparents who are lonely and in danger. We continued. But the exercise, what it did for us was it helped us name our sadnesses and share them with each other. And once we began to mourn together, we also knew what to ask God for. Once we named our griefs, we knew how to pray. And I think this could be a great way to begin with a congregation or a group who wants to be involved in fighting climate change and organizing and grieving in all of these bits, in becoming a center for resilience and hope. I know that a lot of denominations have created liturgies of lament for climate change. My own Episcopal denomination has, and it's beautiful. And if you just Google around, you can find all kinds of prayer services that have been created in response to the climate crisis and to the grief that we're feeling. And those are helpful, those are useful. But I think that there's something different that happens when we begin by asking each other, what are you sad about? It's not that far off from one of the basic principles of community organizing, right? When you go into a place or a community to try to help, you don't go in and say, here's what we need, here's what you need. You go in and you ask people, what needs do you have? And we're doing the same thing here. Get your group together and ask them to each make an acrostic of their grief for the climate crisis. And then once each individual has thought through that and started working through the structure, they can share with each other. And maybe from there, you create a set of prayers particular to your specific community and needs. and griefs. So I think when we begin there, it gets people engaged in the prayers in a way that's different from when you come into a Sunday service and there are some prayers that you read and they may be beautiful, but if you're not engaged in the creation of them, you're just connected to those prayers and liturgies differently. So bringing people in to create their own liturgies of lament, it's a great place to begin. It builds community. It builds a real personal investment in the prayers. And I think there you write your liturgies together and you call on God. And only after that do you turn to action. Theologian Walter Brueggemann says, lament is the seedbed of hope. And I think what he means by that is that when we practice lament together, we're tilling the soil so that something new can grow in a place where something has not been growing. I think it's action that feeds hope. But before action needs to come lament. First, we have to name our griefs. And that helps us see what needs to be changed. And that gives us a way to begin to move from grieving together to working together. And that is a little bit about what Avery is going to share with you next, are some actual examples of how communities have been working together. So Avery, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Thanks so much, Amy. And yeah, thanks for just starting by grounding us in lament and grief and the recognition that our grief is real, that climate grief is real, and that having rituals and liturgies that we can do, especially in community, in our congregational communities, that is climate action. That is absolutely climate action. And it's where we need to start. And like Amy said, we can't end there, that we need to be moving from grief into action. So I'm going to share a little bit about resilience and what it looks like to build resilience in your congregation. And I do have some slides to share, so I'll get that going here. There we go. Attempt number 2. All right. So again, my name is Avery Davis Lamb. I am the co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries. And again, it's just such a gift to be here with you all on a Sunday afternoon. You could be outside enjoying a beautiful fall day, but instead you're here talking about eco-grief and resilience. And I thank you for that, because this is important work. So the mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to equip, educate, and mobilize Christian communions, denominations, and congregations to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. We represent the creation care and the environmental justice policies of 38 major Christian denominations throughout the United States. And that really spans the theological spectrum. We represent all of the mainline denominations, Reformed denominations, many of the Baptist denominations, and even several Orthodox communions. So in May of last year, we launched the Faithful Resilience Program. And what we saw around us leading up to this was that climate disasters were having devastating impacts on communities, and particularly those communities who do not have the resources to prepare for and respond to climate disasters. And so we got to thinking, how can the church what's the role for the church here? How can the church be a hub of resilience in these places that do not have investment from local or state or federal governments, particularly in rural areas or in areas with lower incomes and communities of color? So that led us to the Faithful Resilience Program. And central to that program is this question. And this is what Lela named in my intro, but just to share it again, how can congregations be hubs of climate resilience in their community, helping their neighbors weather the physical and the spiritual storms of the climate crisis? This question is going to be central to our churches, whether or not we like it in the next century. And so it's really a question of how we respond to the biggest crisis of our time, because the climate crisis is here and our churches need to be preparing and responding. So what is resilience? Well, I want to start us out with a definition, because resilience really can be a vague term. It's one of those hot terms right now that gets thrown around a lot. And I want to be clear on what I'm talking about when I talk about climate resilience. So I'm taking this definition from a report called Pathways to Resilience that came from the Kresge Foundation in 2015. And they define resilience as climate mitigation. So that means reducing greenhouse gases as quickly as we possibly can to prevent out of control climate change. Adaptation, which means forming our social and our physical structures to adapt for the way that climate change is already here with us. And deep democracy, so that ensures that our systems of democracy are reshaped so that everyone is able to participate in our democratic system. And importantly, I think a piece of this definition that is crucial is that rather than just bouncing back from a disaster, this resilience framework is about using crisis as an opportunity to bounce forward to a more just and equitable society. So seeing the climate crisis as a crisis, of course, but also an opportunity, a threshold perhaps, that we can walk through into the beloved community. So why is this important? Well, I don't need to spend too much time here, because you all are aware, and of course I know many of you are on the front lines of the climate crisis. But here's what we're seeing around us. We're seeing simultaneous climate disasters, record-breaking fires in the West Coast, record-breaking hurricanes all up the east, floods and heat waves throughout the heartland. And so again, resilience is proactive. And so we both need to be prepared to deal with these disasters that we're seeing unfold all around us, and to take action to limit their severity. So we have these large-scale disasters, but we also have these slower, everyday impacts that I know are already affecting those of you in Mobile and other parts of Alabama. Things like sunny day flooding. Here we're looking at Annapolis and Miami, where this is a particular problem. This is, in the words of author Rob Nixon, the slow violence of climate change. And these are, of course, only a few of the many, many impacts of climate change, those impacts that I know you all are already feeling. And this is important because churches are going to feel these impacts as severely as any other institution. Churches are not protected from the realities of the climate crisis. And they're in a position to prepare and respond, to use their social and their physical and the spiritual assets of the community to build resilience in order to better weather the slow and the quick violences of climate change. And so to understand how churches can be hubs of resilience, I think we need to first understand how they and their communities will be impacted. And so this is a project that I worked on last summer, which is pulling together data from just about 75,000 congregations across the United States and comparing it to different forms of sea level rise and storm surge and fires using a tool called GIS. And this map is embedded on our website. You can find it at creationjustice.org/resilience. You could even go there now if you want and follow along. We'll just have screenshots here. But what we're going to look at is, we're just going to look at sea level rise. And it's just because that's a proxy for thinking about resilience. But of course, we need to build resilience to fires and to other floods, but we'll just look at sea level rise today. So what we're looking at right now is sea level as it currently is. So through these maps, the dark blue is just current sea level. But what you'll see over the next few slides is a lighter blue. And that lighter blue is sea level rise projections. And this is coming directly from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data. So let's look at what the Gulf Coast will look like with 3 feet of sea level rise. You can see here that there's quite a bit of saltwater inundation between current sea level and 3 feet of sea level rise. And then, of course, when we look at 6 feet of sea level rise, it's even more severe. But what I want us to do is zoom in a little bit here and look specifically in the neighborhood where I know a lot of you are, which is coastal Alabama, but also going from the panhandle of Florida over to Louisiana. So again, this is current sea level. Dark blue is all current sea level. We'll look at 3 feet of sea level rise here. You can see some inundation, and then 6 feet of sea level rise. And the reason I'm using 3 feet and 6 feet here is that 3 feet is what we can expect in about 50 years if we continue business as usual. So that's if we don't make any changes, no mitigation actions, changes to greenhouse gas emissions, we could reasonably expect about 3 feet of sea level rise. And the same is true for 6 feet in about a century. So this, I think on our short timelines, as we frequently think, a century is not a long time, but I would bet most of the churches, many of the churches you're a part of, have been in existence for more than a century. And yet for some of them, they may not exist in a century because of sea level rise. And so this map is great, and it's really helpful in understanding the situation. But I think one of the realities here is you look at this map and just immediately go to grief. What can we do? And again, we need to be looking at this map and looking at the data and looking at the science and grieving that and knowing that grief is a part of it, as Amy was talking. And I hope that this map will spur us towards action, because this data here begs an important question for faith institutions. And that's institutions that are both local churches and for our national denominations. And that question is, how are you going to plan for the churches and congregations that are going to be underwater in 40, 60, 100 years? And perhaps even more importantly, how are you going to plan to serve the community that will be devastated from the invading sea? So here's one way that this tool can get us started on that question. And that's that we can use these maps to identify where faith communities are most impacted and how they can be hubs of climate resilience. So I'm zoomed in on Mobile here. I'm sure this looks familiar to many of you. And I've gone ahead and clicked on St. Paul's Episcopal Church, which, as you can see, is right along the coastline there. And St. Paul's could very well be underwater with 3 feet of sea level rise. And so how can St. Paul's Episcopal Church prepare for this reality? How can it serve as an ark for its community, many of whose homes and lives are going to be underwater? And then maybe the other St. Paul's. What about St. Paul's Lutheran Church on the other side of the water? How can this St. Paul's, which will very likely not be underwater, but will still be serving a heavily flooded community, practice climate hospitality? How can it welcome those who are either impacted or displaced because of sea level rise? How can it be in solidarity with those frontline communities? What choices can it make now so that when severe flooding does happen, it's ready to help its community? These questions will define the witness of our faith over the next century. And Christian leaders, I think we think a lot about how to stay relevant. And I mean, here's the answer right here. You stay relevant by preparing for the oncoming climate crisis by building resilience in your community? What is more relevant than preparing for these disasters? So I'm going to transition in a moment and share 6 themes around which churches and congregations can engage in the work of building climate resilience. But first, I want to share a video about a community in coastal Georgia that's building resilience and how they're asking our leaders to do the same.
Truth is a lonely place, but it is the only place. If we don't deal with truth, what you're going to end up having is the fiction that has brought us to the place to where democracy right now is in jeopardy.
The communities here on the coast are Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are on the front line of the impact of climate change, particularly here in Brunswick, where there is a tremendous amount of flooding that results from tropical storms, sea level rise, and they are experiencing these impacts at alarming rates.
September of last year, and we had an unusual rainy day. And yes, we're on the coast, so high tide plus rain means flooding. And we probably had about maybe 3 feet of water that was just standing here in this area. And in light of what we experienced last year and what it cost us here, we decided that we want to do our part in trying to protect what we have here. And so we started boarding up the holes in which the water can infiltrate underneath the structure and put sandbags up. And so that if we can't have the structures in place that will protect us, we have to protect ourselves. But everybody can't afford sandbags. Everybody can't afford to always move away or protect themselves when flooding happens. Some people have lived in this particular city all their lives. Can't afford to go anywhere else. And they can barely afford to stay where they are. And those are the people who really need the funding to come in to improve the area and the conditions in which they live.
This is where these winding roads have led.
I don't think that people even recognize that climate change is a spiritual destruction, and we have transferred faith into fear. If you ain't got no courage, you ain't got no faith. And if you ain't got no faith, you ain't got no God. And that's what's done happened to us.
I will rise up. I will not fall.
Churches have dug real deep into their coffers and are meeting the needs of communities that are being impacted by climate change. I think that the federal government should be also investing in robust, rich, bold economic recovery as well as infrastructure.
This will be the day.
People don't want to do the new restorative jobs because it costs training. But I think we have to sort of take a step back and pause for a minute to say, but what is it costing us in the future?
But if we are to walk in the path that Jesus has set before us, perhaps we should let the idea of scarcity, we shouldn't let it stop us so easily.
As I referenced in my sermon today, that God can do amazing things with just a little bit, but we have to do our part as well.
Thinking that we don't have the time or the money or the energy might be self-limiting when we actually have access to much more than we can ever imagine.
I will stay strong, never giving up faith. I will go all the way. This will be the day.
So that film was one of two the Creation Justice Ministries produced over the summer, one in collaboration with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, and another in collaboration with North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light. And I'd encourage you to watch both of those films. I've dropped the link in the chat. We also have a congregational screening guide that you can use to share those with your church if you so choose. But what I love about these stories is the ways in which the faith leaders who are highlighted are creatively responding to the crises of their local community. And I want to share a little bit about 6 ways of engaging in faithful resilience, because like we heard about the churches in Brunswick, they're thinking about advocacy, they're thinking about their community, they're thinking about their buildings, and of course, as we saw, they're thinking about worship. And so I'll share about this Faithful Resilience Guide and about these 6 themes very briefly. And I encourage you, as we go through here, think about the assets of your own community, of your own congregation. What do you have that you can bring to bear to help your community adapt and respond to the climate crisis? So with land, how can we change how we treat our land to care for our neighbors and build climate resilience? How can we create a just and beautiful world for our neighbors now and into the future? How can we prepare to support our local community in climate disasters? How can we welcome our local and global neighbors who are displaced from the climate crisis? How can our buildings be sanctuaries from climate disasters? And how can our worship and teaching encourage the building of a resilient community? So I wanted to provide a few takeaways for you here today. So here's what I would say are the top takeaways of what you can do in the short term and in the long term at your community. These are a few starting points, and these are also reflected in the Faithful Resilience Guide, which is a 6-part guide that's available at creationjustice.org/resilience. So again, here's the Faithful Resilience Guide. This is a great way to start talking with your community about climate resilience. This can be applied either as a Bible study guide, as a sermon series, if you are a preacher or pastor, or as a series to go through with your green team. If you have a green team there, this is a great way to get started. Each of the 6 parts in this include scriptural grounding. It includes action items, reflection questions, and a case study, especially digging into those cases that you saw through the last 6 slides. I will share that this is a Christian-oriented guide. Creation Justice Ministries is a Christian organization, so we are drawing from the Christian tradition. However, you're welcome to take this content and adapt it for however it would work for your community. A few other resources to share with you. Again, I mentioned the Faithful Resilience films are available, both the stories from North Carolina and the stories from Georgia, which we watched together. And that's at creationjustice.org/faithfulresilience-films. And then we also have an ongoing series of resilience workshops, all of which are recorded and available at youtube.com. And actually that's youtube.com/creationjustice-ministries. So even easier to remember than what I have listed here. You can also just search Creation Justice Ministries and YouTube, and you'll find this playlist pretty easily. And I just want to end us with a prayer here. So please join me for this prayer. Like Job in the whirlwind, or Jonah in the storm at sea, we come before you in awe of your power, God. We recognize that today's storms and whirlwinds are not your judgment on your people, but the distortion of natural systems through our own sin and hubris. As the storms and whirlwinds of the climate crisis accelerate around us, may our sanctuaries be a place of refuge and resilience, where all of God's creation might be protected and sustained, and from which we people of God might be sent forth to bring healing and justice. Amen. Here's my email address, and again, the Creation Justice / Resilience website. Please, if you have any questions or if you're interested in building resilience in your community, please reach out. And thanks so much for listening today.
Oh, thank you both so much for that wonderful presentation. I know that is exactly what we needed. At least it is for me. I am not an introvert. I don't have a particularly introspective bone in my body. So I want to have action. I want to have ideas that we can do through our churches, including how do we structure liturgy? What can we have the churches do, the physical assets? So perfect. Thank you so much. At this time, if anybody has questions, I have a burning question that I'm fixing to ask, but if you can either type it and put it in chat, you can go to that bottom little reaction button and raise your hand. And when it's your turn, you can turn on your video and your microphone and ask what you want to ask. Or you can shout it out if there's a moment of silence, however you want to do it. So my question is, I was telling a friend of mine about this presentation that we had planned, and I was talking about how we need to think about liturgies of lament in the church, and her reaction, but would anybody come? Why would somebody come to a liturgy of lament? And so that made me think, it's part of the issue is that so many people are in denial that there is a problem. And it occurs to me that one of the things that we need to lament is the fact that we are in denial that our style of life needs to change. We need to realize we are going to have to give up things like all the way just starting from the internal combustion engine, which is coming rapidly down the path, to just the way we have food readily available. There's just, it's not the story that Amy told about the whale. That's just so heart-wrenching, and that is such a story of grief. And you can imagine that mother lamenting what had happened and even asking God, why did this happen? But the looking ahead and realizing what we're facing, I can see where you just go straight into denial. So what role do you see the churches playing, I guess, in overcoming that denial and making people see that, they need to come to liturgies of lament? We need to work through that so that we can get to the action point.
Wow. Yeah, that's such a good point, Lola. I feel like there are two groups of people who would say, why would people come to that? And one group are those people who are aware of what's happening, but have moved through that to denial. And another group are people who just aren't even aware yet, right? They just live in a world where that isn't something that comes to the forefront very often. The first thing that comes to mind for me is Avery and I met through Duke Divinity School, and we took a class there called Preaching Hope for Creation, and really focused on what a preacher can do as they're preaching, even just through the lectionary scriptures, right? To bring themes of creation care out in their preaching, to help cultivate, I think, love for place and for non-human creation through the language they choose to use as they speak about it, through the stories they choose to tell. So I think preaching can be a first step in sort of softening hearts and opening eyes to get people to the place where they might think about coming to a liturgy or a lament service for climate grief. I also think that young people are really in tune with climate grief. I know, my daughter, who's 12, read a book of speeches from Greta Thunberg and was really moved by it. And when you look at like the Sunrise group that's organizing for climate change, it's being led by high schoolers. And so I think this might be a place in which young people can lead us towards our grief, towards our awareness of our grief. And if young people see the church being active and engaged, I think that'll also help draw young people into the church. Avery, do you have thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I love all of those, Amy. I think one thing that I'll add is, even climate deniers are going to have things to grieve from the climate crisis, even if they don't understand that it's climate change. And I think creating a space in our congregations to not just grieve kind of climate change, as an idea, as something that's happened, but grieve the particularities of how climate change is impacting on our communities and making the connection that this is a climate disaster. So, for example, after a hurricane comes through, maybe I would imagine most of your congregations probably do have some sort of vigil or some sort of grieving ritual, because that's so important for a community to do that together. And I think places like that, it's important for us to name the role that climate is playing. So, it's not just sort of creating these new climate rituals, but it's infusing climate into the ones that already exist, because climate is everywhere. And I think if we're going to reach folks who aren't already convinced, then that's going to be how.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has started any attempt at a resilience program at their church. We actually did try some of that and are in the process of it. And I have to say that it was met with, in one case, anger. That we would, we would try to do that, take that liberal stance, with, when, if you don't feel climate change is real, then it becomes a political football. And so what we ended up doing is forming a committee of largely young people. So, because in some ways it's sad to say, incumbent on young people to talk about it to their elders and tell them how much fear and angst they're experiencing by realizing that they're, as somebody phrased it recently, that they're training for jobs and for opportunities that may not even be there. And so the hopelessness of what they're dealing with. Is there, I guess a question is, like many mainline churches, we are experiencing a dearth of young people. So how do you see, I guess I'm trying to figure out a workaround. We scraped enough young people up for this resilience committee, but how do you see us attracting folks? And Deacon Joey, I see your hand up and we'll call on you in just a second, but do either of you have any quick words on attracting the youth to come in with this issue?
I mean, Avery and I were talking about this just the other day, actually, but I think part of the answer is to go where people are already organizing on this issue. So to show up as a member of your church to your local chapter of Sunrise, or, in my neighborhood, we have an association that is devoted to the watershed in this part of the state. So showing up to the Watershed Association just as a Christian, as a member of your church, and starting to make the connections with the people outside of the church who are already doing the work, I think is one step. Avery, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think that's one step. And I would say that's the first step, is just, if you care about this, going out and supporting the groups already doing the work, And, I think the other thing is just trying to be genuine in the, your worship and your education and all of that. And, maybe young people will come, but maybe they won't, honestly, and you will have done the right thing. And it won't have been because you weren't talking about climate change, so that's just the only other piece that I'd add is talk about climate change and maybe they'll come.
And when you say that, it makes me think that we have a group called Mobile Baykeeper, and the bulk of that group is young people.
Yeah.
And so if we show up as Gulf Coast Creation Care or as members of our church and say, we want to see what we can do, they're seeing the churches. So, I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, the other thing is, offering your space to groups like that, environmental justice groups, they often need spaces to meet and to do trainings and workshops and things. And, that's an asset that your church could provide in a space that's, generally not used 5 or 6 days a week.
Right. Good point. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. I don't see anything typed into the chat, but Deacon Joey, did you have your hand up to ask a question?
Yeah, I did. Actually, it was kind of a piggyback on both of them. First on Amy. I remember last year at our diocesan convention, our previous presiding bishop, Catherine Jeffert Shiori, she gave the keynote on creation care. And she talked about the fact that we should be spending half of our time in lament and half of our time in resilience. And that really hit me. And what hit me today, Amy, when you were about that, is I'm sitting here thinking, well, I spend every day in the daily office, and son of a gun, if 3 out of 4 services aren't in lament with the confession of sin right in there. So it's like, it is just a way of life, and I didn't realize it. And with regard to the liturgy, at our church, we did a season of creation when we went offline and we created a liturgy for 5 weeks on the season of creation, and we went off of the daily lectionary. Our bishop gave us permission, and it was very, very, very transformative for 5 weeks of the same language. And then Avery, the other thing I wanted to say about you is with those maps, boy, the biggest guy in trouble here is the Diocese of Louisiana with all of that water on our coast. And to that, I would like to say that I really think it's important that our and our diocese make it local. I just had a conversation with the bishop on Thursday and said, Joey, people aren't going to relate to wildfires too much in our diocese, but they sure as heck are going to relate to coastal flooding. And so we're going to be spending a lot of our time really zooming in locally, on those things. So thank you for very much for reminding me of those things.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Deacon Joey. And you're exactly right. It's so tempting to, look to COP26 and to, look to all these kind of big global climate change things. And yes, those are important, but at the end of the day, climate change is a local issue because that's where we feel the impacts. So thanks for that comment.
Okay, does anybody else want to unmute and ask a question? If you do now, speak now, or our time is pretty much up. Okay, not hearing anything. You two have been wonderful. This is exactly what we needed for the culmination of this workshop series, some good action items. I'd refer everybody to the chat. You can put your cursor in the chat and hit Control-C and copy it into a Word document. You'll have everything in the chat, which I just learned a couple months ago. So yeah, thank you both very, very much. Appreciate that. And Rhoda, take it away to wrap up.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, I add my thanks also to Avery and Amy for their inspirational presentations, and for everyone that's here taking your time out of your Sunday afternoon to join us. For those of you who missed any of our other 3 sessions, they are on our website and they're also on our Facebook page. And go out and enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.